Hi everyone, I'm reading Global Woman by Arlie Hochschild again. This is part two, so we'll watch part one first, but part two of chapter 11, which is called Among Women, Migrant Domestics and Their Taiwanese Employers. So I'll just jump right into it. Safeguarding the nuclear family. Some daughters-in-law use domestic workers to protect their nuclear families from the intervention of extended kin. Young mothers-in-law who are in good health may not yet become recipients of filial kin work, but they often provide kin labor for their sons and daughters in the form of unpaid or underpaid childcare, cooking, and housekeeping for dual-earner young couples. In return for this labor, these mothers-in-law expect to secure three-generation cohabitation and close bonds to their sons' families. From the perspective of adult children, however, especially daughters-in-law, the assistance also threatens to allow mothers-in-law to interfere with or dominate the conjugal family. Childcare is often the source of conflicts between women across generations. In addition to the child's mother, the mother-in-law is traditionally defined as a child's primary caregiver. She supervises her daughter-in-law in the care of her son's children and intervenes when the job is not being done in a way she deems proper. It is common for Taiwanese mothers-in-law to care for grandchildren if their daughters-in-law work outside of the home. This happens not only in three-generation households, but also in situations where mothers-in-law live nearby. Catherine and her husband, in their early 30s, both received MBAs in the United States and work in Taipei as market consultants. When Catherine returned to work after 3 months of maternity leave, her mother-in-law took over caring for the couple's newborn baby. The couple sent the baby to her grandparents' house every morning and picked her up after work. Without being asked to, Catherine paid the mother-in-law $18,000 from Taiwan, but $530 per month, an amount equivalent to the lower end wage of a local caregiver. Although she did not have to worry the way she might have had she left the child with a stranger, Catherine felt that this arrangement caused difficulty and tension between her and her mother-in-law. We argued almost every day. She was just exhausted, unhappy, and then she gave me a poker face. Every time we picked up our daughter, we didn't know if we should leave or stay. If we left, she would say, "You guys just want to get your child." If we stayed, she would say, "I had been working so hard, I took care of your child, and I also have to cook your dinner." She was not saying these things to her son, only to her daughter-in-law. Not only was Catherine's mother-in-law exhausted by the work of caring for a newborn baby, but she also felt deprived. She felt that she had sacrificed the comfort of her old age in order to maintain her son's family, a duty that was supposed to fall to her daughter-in-law. Catherine later hired a migrant live-in worker to care for her daughter. She spent the money in order to spare the emotional cost. Adult children who seek a way out of binds like Catherine's often generate parenting practices that deviate from tradition. Neophyte Taiwanese parents seek guidance not only from their parents, but also through books by experts, many of which are translated from English. Young mothers hire nannies to safeguard their parental autonomy and to avoid confrontations with the older generation. For example, Anne, a 32-year-old bank manager, explained why she preferred a migrant caregiver to her mother-in-law. When there are different opinions regarding childcare, you somehow have to listen to the elderly. Then you lose your autonomy. I cannot control my mother-in-law, but I can control my Filipina maid, right? By hiring a foreign maid, women employers not only solve the problem of childcare, but also avoid arguing with their husbands over who does the laundry and the dishes. Some Taiwanese husbands, mostly from younger generations, are willing to share some housework, but their mothers object. For example, when I asked Su Yun, a 43-year-old real estate agent, if her husband helped out with housework, she answered, "More or less. He's a neat person. Once he saw some dirt on the floor and couldn't help but mop it up. The maid was on vacation or something. Then his mom came to our house and was shocked when she saw this. She must be thinking, my son never did anything like this in my house. Now he's mopping the floor. So I rushed to ask my husband to stop. I would do that later." This scenario demonstrates not only a divide between traditional and modern notions of marriage, but also an implicit competition between the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law over the son. The extended family and conjugal family are marked as separate territories dominated by the two women across generations. My house versus your floor. The mother-in-law viewed the son's participation in housework as an indicator of his subordination to his wife, and concomitantly of the weakening of his ties to his mother and extended family. Some daughters-in-law, such as Emily, a 30-year-old financial consultant, hire a maid to avoid potential disputes on the division of housework. I'm thinking that when my daughter gets married in the future, I'll also hire a Filipina maid for her. That way she can avoid a lot of problems with her mother-in-law. You can't let your mother-in-law do housework like cleaning and cooking, but you also feel reluctant to do it alone. There's no way she'll let her son do it, right? Some female employers more assertively use the employment of domestic workers as a strategy to resist three-generation cohabitation. Xiao Li, 36-year-old, has a junior college degree and worked as a nurse before giving birth to her son. Her mother-in-law volunteered to move to Taipei to be the family's live-in caregiver, but Xiao Li rejected this proposal, saying that she would seek a migrant caretaker. Xiao Li described what happened then. My mother-in-law is a very sharp woman. She said to me, "Your father-in-law thinks hiring a Filipina maid is a bad idea." She wouldn't say that it was she who thought it was a bad idea. Whoever she ran into, my friends, relatives, she told them, "You talk to Xiao Li. Tell her to let me watch the child." Anyway, the main point is that she wants to live with her son. She doesn't really love the grandson, she loves her son. Xiao Li's mother-in-law exerted her social pressure by proxy, framing her objection as though it were that of her husband. After all, he was the extended family's patriarchal authority. I went on to ask Xiao Li what her husband thought. She replied, Him? Of course he'd like to live with both his wife and his mother. Then he could be a baby forever. Everything would be taken care of by others. In another interview, I heard a story about a mother-in-law when visiting her son's house expressed her anger by throwing out the baggage of the migrant worker. She thought that if there was no Filipina maid, the couple would have invited her to live with them and take care of her grandchildren. These mothers-in-law feel anguish not because their grandchildren have been taken away by the domestic workers, but because they have been denied the link they would have enjoyed with their sons' families, even in lieu of cohabitation. Unlike Mrs. Chang, Xiao Li has a contentious relationship with her Filipina worker, Julia. Julia is college educated and plans to pursue a master's degree after saving enough money from working overseas. Xiao Li bluntly admits that she has been a mean boss to Julia, but she explains this as more a product of contextual factors than an innate personality clash. She has not yet found a suitable job after quitting her nursing position prior to giving birth. Being a stay-at-home mother has brought her a sense of loss and isolation. Her insecurity is aggravated by the presence of a well-educated maid and by the pressure from her husband and mother-in-law. The reason I don't get along with the maid is because of all the pressure my mother-in-law and my husband put on me. They complained, "Why are you not working? What are you doing at home every day?" Well, every day I watch her, the maid, and I pick on her. She has an advanced degree, so she feels humiliated. If I were working, all this wouldn't have happened, because you gain nothing at home, so you become picky and cranky all day long. A Chinese proverb says, "A daughter-in-law must suffer to become a mother-in-law." A young bride who experiences hardships in a patriarchal extended family, in other words, eventually accedes to authority by controlling the next generation of daughters-in-law. Women offset patriarchal domination by controlling other subordinate women, daughters-in-law in the case of mothers-in-law, and foreign maids in the case of young women employers. Daughters-in-law like Xiao Li seek domestic help to lessen the gendered obligations placed upon them, but ironically, they then become authority figures similar to their mothers-in-law. Smoothing tensions and anxieties at home. Jessica, 32, has worked in several international banks and has been promoted to a managerial position in her current job. She married a coworker 4 years ago and moved in with her husband's parents. Although she abides by the tradition of three-generation cohabitation, Jessica is determined to continue her career after giving birth to her daughter. To solve the thorny problems of childcare and housework, she wishes to hire a Filipino worker, as many of her coworkers have. However, she recounts, "I went through a revolution to hire my Filipina maid." She spent half a year convincing her mother-in-law, who threw out various objections such as, "This is a waste of money. Hiring a foreigner at home is not safe," and "Maybe it's better for you to quit and stay home." Jessica's story is not atypical. Many daughters-in-law have to fight to convince their mothers-in-law that they are not irresponsible mothers or lazy wives. After all, most older Taiwanese women were full-time homemakers and mothers when they were the age of their daughters-in-law. Shin Yi, a homemaker in a nuclear household, recalls, "My mother-in-law always said it was kind of weird that I don't work but still hire a maid. Weird is the word she used. Of course, I know what she meant by that. She thinks I'm just lazy and I shouldn't have hired a maid." Similar pressures came to bear on Wanru, an employed woman in an extended household, when she brought her new Filipina maid to see her mother-in-law. When I asked Wanru why she brought the maid to meet her mother-in-law directly on her arrival, she replied, "Well, you have to let the mother-in-law know about this. You have to let her understand that you hired a maid to help, not because you want to be a Xiao Nai Nai, young mistress in the house." My mother-in-law had a misunderstanding like this in the beginning. She would say, "Wow, someone else has done everything for you. You have no work to do. You have such great fortune." Many of these mothers-in-law fear not only that their links to their sons will be weakened, but that they will be replaced by the domestic workers. Pei Chi and her husband, both in their 40s, own and manage a small company that produces and exports computer chips. The husband's mother moved from the province to live with them in Taipei and to help raise her 3 grandchildren. 5 years ago, Pei Chi and her husband decided to hire a Filipina maid to take over the household chores so that the mother-in-law could focus on childcare. Pei Chi's mother-in-law, however, expresses not relief but anxiety, as Pei Chi recounts. "The first time the Filipina maid moved in, my mother-in-law was really, really upset. She felt that we had deprived her of her rights of working. Raising children and doing housework are not only her responsibilities, but also her only achievement. She values herself solely based on that. So in the beginning, she was wondering if we didn't want her anymore, if we wanted to kick her out, if she still had any surplus value. We had to communicate with her again, and finally we decided to save one job for her, cooking." Laughs. Because Pei Chi's mother-in-law has been a full-time homemaker all her life, domestic labor is her domain of mastery and the foundation of her identity. She interpreted Pei Chi's hiring of a Filipina maid as an expression of doubt about her professional skills and a diminishment of her contribution to the family. She was also worried that Pei Chi and her husband didn't want her anymore, that they would kick her out once her work was transferred to the migrant worker. The social norm of 3-generation cohabitation has attenuated, and the moral idea of filial piety can no longer guarantee paybacks from children. Parents thus struggle to present their surplus value to their sons' families because they worry that they will lose economic and emotional support at frail ages. Frequently, the mother-in-law feels threatened by the arrival of a professional domestic worker on her territory. Because older Taiwanese speak little English, the language barrier further exacerbates the tension between mothers-in-law and Filipino domestic workers. Says Jessica of her mother-in-law, "She feels lost in her life. Her life has no more goals. All her jobs have been taken away by the Filipina maid, and the maid does an even better job than she did. To her, everything is out of control now, and she cannot even control the Filipina maid because she doesn't speak English." A daughter-in-law who hires a migrant worker may have lightened her physical workload, but she has often taken on the additional emotional labor of soothing her mother-in-law's tensions and anxieties. One common strategy among female employers is to confirm the mother-in-law's authority. For example, they intentionally have their mothers-in-law release wages to the migrant workers even though the money is actually from the young couple. Women employers also manipulate translations to minimize tensions between mothers-in-law and domestic workers. Jessica's mother-in-law felt so anxious about the worker's presence that she tried to outperform the worker around the house, especially in cooking, a domestic duty with considerable cultural and affective significance. One day, the mother-in-law made an unusual and complicated dish for the family. The message behind this dish, Jessica said, was clear. "I have been married into this family for years, and I never saw her cook that dish. She did this on purpose. It's a performance." But for whom was Jessica's mother-in-law performing? For the Filipina maid. She was trying to tell the maid, "See, it's not that easy to take over my job. This is my territory. I can do a lot of things you cannot, so don't think you can replace me." Jessica took the opportunity to translate the worker's comments on that dish in a way that she knew would mitigate her mother-in-law's anxieties. By exaggerating the worker's compliments of the mother-in-law's cooking skills, she validated a hierarchical distinction between mother-in-law and the maid. "I tried to sugarcoat the words of the Filipina maid when I translated them," I said. "Mama, the maid said it's delicious. Chinese food becomes like magic at your hands. You can compete with those chefs in 5-star restaurants." Then my mother-in-law was happy, and she put more food on the maid's plate. The loss of status these mothers-in-law fear is no small thing. Indeed, the subordination of daughters-in-law and the authority accorded to mothers-in-law have affected the quality of life for generations of Taiwanese women. Marjorie Wolf reported that in 1905, young adult women in Taiwan had a high rate of suicide compared with senior women, who had a relatively low suicide rate, coinciding with their empowered status. Yet, Yao Hui, who later found that in 1984, the suicide rate for young women significantly dropped, even as older women became more likely to take their own lives. The suicidal tendency among older women is partly explained by their decline in family status and economic security. Such women have been adversely affected by the transformation of gender and intergenerational relations in Taiwan. As young adults, this generation of women sacrificed career achievement for the welfare of family. All the while, they looked forward to enjoying a secure and easy old age. But after surviving their own difficulties as daughters-in-law, they are not accorded the authority that their mothers-in-law received in the past. Facing modern daughters-in-law who seek self-realization and autonomy as wage earners, mothers-in-law struggle to enhance their status in the family, even by contributing their kin labor in exchange for economic security and social support. Fictive kin across ethnic boundaries. Migrant domestic workers constitute a potential threat for some mothers-in-law, but these foreign workers may also become primary caregivers and fictive kin for Taiwanese elders whose adult children subcontract their filial duty. I conducted some interviews in a small town in mid-Taiwan, where most residents make their living on farms or factories. The town's population is aging because many younger villagers have left their parents and gone to cities in search of advanced education and white-collar jobs. This small town is, however, not untouched by globalization. Advertisements for agencies recruiting foreign caretakers are posted all over mailboxes and telephone poles. In the early morning, Filipino or Indonesian women are seen wheeling Taiwanese elders for walks along the field. In the afternoon, they gather in front of the temple with Taiwanese elders sitting in one circle and migrant women chatting to each other in another. Ama Lin was born to a poor farming family in 1913. She never attended formal school, and she married a farmer's son when she was 16. Discovering that she was infertile, she adopted a daughter and a son. The daughter committed suicide in her early 30s. The son got married and moved to Taipei. After her husband died, Ama Lin lived on her own until she had a bad fall and became half paralyzed 3 years ago. She disliked Taipei and did not get along with her daughter-in-law. After the accident, she lived in a nursing home for a year until her son hired a Filipina caretaker, which allowed her to move back to her old house. When I met her, she was 86 years old and frail, but with a clear mind. Talking about her own children through tears, Ama Lin pointed out at her neighbor who has 5 sons and said with envy, "She had a good fortune. She has a lot of children." Rural grandmothers who have accumulated only limited economic resources and rely mostly on their children's financial support occupy the bottom of the elder social ladder. Ama Chen, the neighbor Ama Lin described as having a good fortune, is actually attended by a Filipina caregiver too. Ama Chen has no major illness except diabetes and arthritis. The latter commonly afflicts Taiwanese seniors who used to do heavy farm work. Her 2 sons live in concrete apartments only a few blocks away from Ama Chen's old brick house. When I asked her why she was not living with her sons, she could barely finish her answer for weeping. "The house is theirs, not mine. Children today don't like to live with elders anyway. I am dying, but not dead yet. This is most painful," rubbing her knees in tears. "Every day I cry and cry. I don't want to hire someone, but my son said no, nobody's watching you during the day. I'm a useless person, but only costs them a lot of money." Sigh. "It's better for me to die soon." Poor senior women commonly express feelings of being useless and a burden on their children. Among Taiwan's elderly widowed women have the least access to social security, the heaviest reliance on children's support, and the strongest preference for 3-generation cohabitation. The suicide rate among rural women over 65 is the second highest in the national population, next to that of old rural men. When I asked Ama Lin what she would do when her Filipina caregiver Sylvia finished her contract, she answered in a flat tone, "Me? I don't know. Maybe it's better for me to just die." Sylvia then patted Ama's shoulder, speaking in broken Taiwanese with a heavy Filipino accent. "No, say that." Sylvia is a 40-year-old high school graduate and a mother of 3. She and her husband used to run a small chicken farm and sell eggs in the village. Driven by financial depression at home and drawn by the success stories of migrant villagers, her husband worked in the Middle East until the decline of construction and manufacturing jobs after the Gulf War. Sylvia then took her turn to work abroad, first to Malaysia and then in Taiwan, as a domestic worker and caregiver. Pleasant and patient, Sylvia has earned a reputation in town for being a great caregiver, tolerant with difficult Ama Lin. As we talked in the living room, Sylvia frequently went to the kitchen to check on the pork stew, Ama Lin's favorite dish. She explained that the meat had to be cooked for more than 3 hours until it was tender because Ama Lin has lost most of her teeth. In addition to Chinese cooking, Sylvia has also picked up a good deal of Taiwanese vocabulary in a short time. When street vendors pass by the house hawking their foods or wares, She diligently asks Alma Lin what they are saying, and she repeats the words a few times to memorize their pronunciation. Compared to Alma Lin's son, who visits her only once or twice a month, Sylvia knows a lot about the personal needs and idiosyncrasies of her client. Out of concern for Alma Lin, Sylvia complains to me about the irresponsibility of her children and the provision of medical care. Nobody brings Alma to see the doctor. She doesn't have medicine. During the night, she cried and shouted. She had pain, so I gave her my Filipino medicine. I complained to my employer. They bring her medicine only once a month. To Alma Lin, Sylvia is not merely an employee, but something like fictive kin, a term that describes those who provide care like family and do what family does, and are given the labor of kin with its attendant affection, rights, and obligations. In general, the kinship analogy works best when elderly clients and their care workers are of similar ethnic backgrounds and share cultural knowledge. In this case, Sylvia transcends ethnic and cultural boundaries by learning Chinese cooking, studying the local language, and even sharing the medicine she brought from the Philippines. On the one hand, a fictive kin relationship improves the quality of care and retrieves personal meanings for both the provider and the recipient. On the other hand, when employers place kin expectations on care workers, they may blur the distinction between employees and family members, assigning workers extra labor beyond what was contractually agreed. For example, Miss Lai, a 41-year-old widowed employer, hired a Filipino worker to take care of her ill mother-in-law. After 1 year, the worker ran away and filed an official complaint on account of extra work and long hours. Ms. Lai, however, considered the workload reasonable because she measured it based on the social expectation placed on daughters-in-law. She complained I gave her too much work. Come on, what work? Housework and cooking? What's the big deal? Didn't I have to do all these things before? Which working woman is not like this? Which daughter-in-law doesn't do all these? Migrant workers who are adopted into the families of their care recipients risk subordinating their own families to the needs of their employers. Sylvia forfeited the annual 1-week vacation her contract specified out of loyalty to Alma Lin. During her 2 years in Taiwan, she had no chance to visit her 3 children, who were attended by her mother in the Philippines. Sylvia said with a deep sigh, "My son always says, 'Mom, when are you coming back to the Philippines?' I keep saying, maybe next year, maybe. It will be 2 years this June, but they don't want me to take a vacation. Nobody can take care of her if I am not here." When migrant mothers sell their reproductive labor to maintain their employers' families, they depend on other people's paid or unpaid reproductive labor to fill the void they leave in their own families. Some husbands quit jobs and become full-time housemakers, while other households hire local domestic workers. The majority of migrant workers rely on female kin, grandmothers, aunts, sisters, or other relatives, to take care of their children. These relatives provide care in exchange for a secure flow of monthly remittances from the migrant mothers. Unlike Taiwanese daughters-in-laws who use domestic workers as a means of securing distance from their mothers-in-law, migrant women strengthen their extended kin networks in order to maintain their transnational families while they serve as others' fictive kin overseas. Conclusion. Globalization has participated in the transformation of intergenerational relations among Taiwanese women. As local cultural practices meet global labor forces, 3 types of labor reproduce kin ties. The first is filial kin work, or care conducted in order to maintain intergenerational patrilineal ties. The filial duty of serving aging parents is transferred first from the son to the daughter-in-law, a gender transfer. Later it is outsourced to migrant care workers, a market transfer. The second is kin labor, which is provided by extended kin in order to sustain ties to other family members. The unpaid domestic labor parents offer their adult children is one example of kin labor. Modern daughters-in-law often prefer to hire migrant workers rather than accept the kin labor offered by their mothers-in-law because they fear excessive intervention in their family's domestic lives. The third kind of labor is that of fictive kin, or non-family migrant workers who provide family-like care for elderly clients in lieu of the filial kin work of adult children. As migrant domestic workers have entered Taiwanese households, intergenerational domestic dynamics have become triangulated, with the 3 women forming alliances or antagonisms. In some cases, when daughters-in-law hire migrant workers to subcontract the filial duty, the wives and workers become comrades under the mothers-in-law authority. Other daughters-in-law hire domestic workers in order to resist 3-generation cohabitation, or to minimize the intervention of their mothers-in-law in domestic affairs. These daughters-in-law may become authority figures similar to their mothers-in-law, reproducing the oppressive relationship they seek to escape. Still, other daughters-in-law apply themselves to smoothing the tensions that arise in the daily interactions between mothers-in-law and migrant workers. Finally, mothers-in-law who live apart from their children may develop strong personal ties with their migrant caregivers, who become fictive kin across ethnic and cultural boundaries. The dominant East Asian model of three-generation cohabitation has been praised by policymakers and academics as a time-honored solution to elder care. This romanticized image of family unity obscures intergenerational power struggles. A family-based model of elder care also exacerbates class inequalities among the elderly. The poorer the elderly are, the more dependent they are on their children. Migrant care workers only present a solution to relatively privileged households, which outsource elder care to low-wage migrant women, who then leave their own families to care for others. If senior citizens are to age with independence and dignity, the government should assume elder care as a collective responsibility, providing public pensions and subsidized care. Universal Social Security and health insurance would go a long way toward removing the stigma attached to living on welfare and toward lessening class disparities among the elderly. The market transfer of elder care is unavoidable. Therefore, we should recognize the value of paid care work by better regulating the working conditions of migrant laborers. If we do so, care providers and recipients may be better able to form emotional ties without reproducing the most oppressive aspects of family relationships, the very dynamics that employers are themselves seeking to avoid. And that is the end of that chapter. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed part 2 of chapter 11. Thanks. Bye.